Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rhonda Rosen, and I am the Programming and Exhibitions Librarian here at Hannon Library. On behalf of our entire outreach team, welcome to the last virtual faculty pub night of the semester. Very sad, but we've had such a great year. And I've been looking at the submissions for next fall and spring semester pub nights, and we are going to have a fabulous year for you. So thank you for staying with us this year, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall. Tonight's special guest, Dr. Áine O'Healy, is a professor of modern languages and literatures at LMU's Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts. And she's here to discuss her recent publication, Migrant Anxieties, Italian Cinema in a Transnational Frame. I would like to remind you all that Faculty Pub Night is the library's opportunity to spotlight our amazing faculty accomplishments to our community and beyond. So tell your friends. Before I introduce our speaker, let's go over the ground rules for tonight. We will be recording this evening's presentation, and it will be available shortly on the library's YouTube channel. After Professor O'Healy's presentation, I will have a short one-on-one conversation with her, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question for our speaker during the presentation, you are welcome to submit it by using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. All questions will be compiled by our outreach team and submitted to our speaker as time permits. We'd like to take a moment to do our land acknowledgement. This event has been organized in part through the Loyola Marymount University and the William H. Hannon Library, and so we use this location to base our land acknowledgement. The land that William H. Hannon Library sits on is seized territory of the Tongva peoples, the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar. We want to start by recognizing their history and calling attention to their presence. We encourage you to learn more about the history of the land where you sit by going to native-land.ca. And if you are on Tovangar in particular, we are pasting 2 additional URLs into the chat box for you to explore as you wish. So, moving along. Professor Áine O'Healy is from the teaches Italian in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at LMU. Born in Ireland, she migrated to the United States as an adult to complete a PhD at the University of Wisconsin. She has taught at various universities in the United States, France, Ireland, Italy, the United Kingdom, and has won several grants, residencies, and fellowships, including a Fulbright to Italy, a visiting research professorship at the University of Rome La Sapienza, and the Dom professorship at LMU. After receiving her PhD, she undertook additional training in film studies at the University of Southern California. To date, she has written, edited, or translated 6 books and has authored more than 60 articles on contemporary Italian culture and cinema, as well as on Irish cinema and transnational filmmaking. She is co-editor of the Global Cinema book series for Palgrave. Her participation in Pub Night is centered on her recent book, Migrant Anxieties, Italian Cinema in a Transnational Frame, published by Indiana University Press. So please join me in welcoming Dr. O'Healy to talk about her book.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to have been invited to do a pub night. I've not done this before, and I have not done a presentation on a webinar like this. So I decided, rather than doing a talking head for 20 minutes, that I would use a PowerPoint to sort of guide my comments on the book, rather than giving a formal reading of a paper. It somehow seemed more appropriate. So my book, which was published in 2019, took 10 years to write, and it's about a contemporary phenomenon that is a pressing issue not only in Europe, but also in our own country. And since I'm a film scholar, I approach it through the lens of filmmaking and representations and the construction of particular anxieties and ideologies through the cinematic image. So I'll start by showing my PowerPoint, sharing my screen, and explaining some of the terms that come into question. Sorry, the PowerPoint seems to have vanished. Here we are. Yes. First of all, I'd like to explain the title because I get a lot of questions. People ask me, why did I call it Migrant Anxieties? Initially, the book was going to be called Italian Cinema in a Transnational Frame, but almost at the last minute, I realized that it is more about affect than about Italian cinema and the way affect is circulated and mediated through film. The focus of the book is a body of films produced since 1990, staging Italy's rapid shift from a nation of emigrants to the destination of millions of migrants arriving from the East and the global South. So this phenomenon of mass migration began approximately at the end of the Cold War, and it's still going on. So here are the different elements in the title: Migrant Anxieties, Italian Cinema in a Transnational Frame. The anxiety here is understood as both affect and emotion. In other words, the anxiety experienced by migrants in the process of movement and displacement, constructed audiovisually by filmmakers. Anxiety also references the responses to migrants by the host population, responses that are often manipulated for political ends. So, transnational frame, that's part of the title too. In their depiction of recent migrations, these films raise questions about regional, national, and transnational identities, as well as Italy's status as a member of the European Union. They occasionally engage with Italy's history of emigration and its history of colonial aggression in the Balkans, in Libya, and the Horn of Africa. So, first of all, with regard to the content of the book, I want to address the issue of terminology. These words are quite charged. People who move to other countries can be described as expats, exiles, emigrants, or immigrants. But they can also be described as economic migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, illegals, or in Italian, they're sometimes called clandestini or extracomunitari. And in France and in general in Europe, they're sometimes called sans-papiers, which means undocumented. Now, these are charged terms. They have different nuances, and also they're used with different intentions, but they are charged with affect, and affect is something that I want to address when I discuss the depiction of migrants in the media and in films. Terminology is also something that comes up in a recently released film called It Will Be Chaos by two Italian documentary filmmakers, Lena Luciano and Filippo Piscopo. And I will run this little clip where you see the mayor of Lampedusa, which is on Italy's southern frontier, trying to tell journalists that they have to be careful with their language when they speak about immigrants. And I will play this now.
Arrivano clandestini? Non sono clandestini, parliamo di profughi e richiedenti asilo. Non arrivano clandestini? Non sono clandestini, parliamo di profughi e richiedenti asilo.
Donc l'économie ne baisse pas, ne chute pas à cause de l'image qui est donnée par les médias justement.
Sì, questa era la domanda, però insomma io la correggevo perché se poi lei deve raccontare al suo paese che da qui passano clandestini, vuol dire che non è...
Elle corrige pour
Se
dire
non
que
capisce lei, non,
oui.
diciamo,
Elle dit c'est des
come
réfugiés
vuole
parce
che
que c'est droit
capiscano gli
d'asile.
altri. Non sono dei semplici sans-papier quelli che passano da Lampedusa.
Réfugiés.
Sono rifugiati.
Si vous
Ok?
voulez réfugiés.
Ma le parole sono importanti.
Attenzione, leggi,
Sì, facciamo entrare anche la consigliere.
Clearly, for us, and I think for you, the top priority has to be to save life, to save people from dying. We should take urgent actions and stronger international coordination.
Al primo posto io ci metto il dovere di offrire un'accoglienza dignitosa, adeguata ai nostri standard.
Humanitarian emergency for the drowning. But you shouldn't have a humanitarian emergency on land.
Come il nostro sistema è pensato per respingerli, non per difendersi da loro, non per accoglierli.
Everybody's shocked, everybody says they want to work, so now's the time. If we're going to do it, now's the time to make the changes.
La forza di Lampedusa è questa, avere visto, avere conosciuto direttamente.
Okay. So here two major issues come up. One is what to call migrants, and the other issue is European policy on migrants and refugees. As the mayor of Lampedusa states, the policy is built to send them back, to reject them, to push them away. Whereas her mandate as the mayor of this small fishing village on the edge of Europe, closer to Africa than to Sicily, her mandate is to give them a humane reception. So there's already a conflict here between anxiety of the other and empathy with the other, which is something that runs through all the films that I'm going to discuss. Most Italian films about migrants allude to unauthorized immigration. Many of them visualize illegal sea crossings. And the ship or boat has become a recurring image in Italian films. Some films include an illegal crossing merely as the part of the backstory. But I should add that in reality, sea crossings are a very small percentage of migrant arrivals. Most immigrants to Italy, even especially the unauthorized immigrants, whom I call in my book irregular migrants, because I don't like the word illegal. Irregular migrants become irregular not because they enter through the border, through the sea border to the south on unauthorized vessels, but they come legally with passports and overstay. So that is the real source of irregular migration in Italy, but nobody acknowledges that. Everybody is focused on the southern borders, on the sea crossings, and on this, with the unspoken issue of race. This is really part of the whole concern about what is described as the crisis of migration. So Italy is in the central Mediterranean. Sicily is closer to Africa than to Rome, as you can see. It's also very close to the Balkans, which means that in the wave of human mobility that began after the end of the Cold War and continued with the various political crises in North Africa and the Middle East in the 21st century, Italy has been the most convenient destination for refugees fleeing violence and upheaval in regions around the Mediterranean. Sorry. So again, my focus on affect is partly inspired by what's going on in the social sciences, because I've noticed that over the past 15 years or so, there has been quite an opening to issues of affect and emotion in the social sciences. And this too has come to be part of the discussion of film studies. So scholars have identified the two main emotions that accompany the shifts in the global era in the contrasting responses of fear and empathy. Films about Italian immigration evoke both, creating representational tensions that produce and, in fact, enhance the dominant sense of anxiety. When Italy began to see the arrival of massive numbers of migrants in the early 90s, they were coming from the East. They were coming mainly from Albania, but also from other former Soviet or socialist countries. Actually, Albania was had an independent communist state that was not part of the Soviet bloc, but it was it had closed borders until 1991. Irregular maritime arrivals mostly occurred through the Adriatic, that is to the east of Italy, between 1991 and 2000. Films made between 1994 and 2005 mainly focus on this route. The first major film on immigration to Italy was inspired by the arrival of tens of thousands of Albanians in 1991, just after the border opened. And this is a news photograph from 1991. On one day, over 20,000 people arrived on the Vlora. The Vlora was a cargo ship that had been commandeered by a group of young people, mostly, who almost on the spur of the moment decided that they would move to Italy. They moved without luggage, without documents, without money, and showed up on this summer day to the consternation of Italians. These televised images of the Vlora triggered hostile responses. They framed the Albanians as abject humans, and at the same time whitened Southern Italians in contrast to their migrant counterparts. And I should explain here that Italians of the North have always regarded Italians of the South as less white. This pattern of racialization is part of Italian national discourse, at least since unification in the late 19th century. So the first film made about, major film made about immigration uses the exodus of the Vlora on August the 8th of 1991 to reflect on aspects of Italian history and in fact to reflect on the Italian present. The significance of the title Lamerica is a deliberate misspelling of the way semi-literate immigrants would have written the word to their families back in Italy. By the 1990s, for Albanians, according to the director, Italy had become what America once was for Italians, a land of promise and opportunity. And they had access to images of Italy, even during the late part of communism, through illicitly received television signals. They were actually able to watch Italian television, even though it was not allowed. And they had built up this idea of the promised land. Shot in Albania, this first film evokes parallels between the destitution of contemporary Albania and the forgotten poverty of Italians in the past. So here is a shot from the film. You have a young man on the left who goes to Albania post-communist era in order to earn a quick buck to perform a business scam. And he meets an older man whom he assumes is Albanian, but he's actually a senile Italian who got stuck in Albania during the fascist campaign, the military campaign of the late 30s. So here two Italians meet each other across the generational divide. And the film director uses this as the staging of two different generations of Italians. And at the same time, because the two men end up on the ship, robbed of their possessions, their money and everything, pretending to be immigrants moving to Italy, because they are both leveled to the same state of abjection. The film sets up this comparison between contemporary Italians and contemporary Albanians, that they share the same experience. And this is a quote from a scholar about how the director achieves this, turning the modern Italian into a hopeful illegal immigrant, clandestino, an illegal immigrant trying to get to Italy. So this is meant to be a reflection on Italy and also a reflection to open up to the other and recognize the parallels in the experiences. So the questions raised by this and subsequent films about migration are how to understand the broader relationships between contemporary immigration and Italy's emigrant past. Italy has had a larger percent of its population emigrate probably than almost any other country in the world from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. Millions emigrated to the Americas and to Northern Europe and to Australia. In some of these countries, Italians were racialized as other. And some of these films about immigration use this trope to draw parallels between contemporary immigrants and Italian immigrants of the past. It also raises the Southern question, which I described before, this gulf between Northern Italians and Southern Italians, and the way the Southern Italians have been racialized in the national imaginary. And it brings to consciousness Italy's own history of military occupation and colonial conquests, because one of the driving forces of these campaigns at the end of the 19th century to Eritrea, for example, was an attempt by the newly unified Italian government to overcome the sort of racialization meted out to immigrants when they went to the Americas. So they figured if Italians instead would go to Africa, they could be the dominant class. And this was tried out first in Eritrea, then Libya, then Somalia, and Ethiopia. So issues of race and racialization intersect with all of these. Later films featuring migrants span a variety of genres and forms: auteur cinema, middlebrow melodramas, comedies, sci-fi, horror, mixed genre, and documentaries. There are a lot of bromances between Italians and foreigners, men, of course, and these always indicate that Italians have a lot to gain from the opening up to the other. But as you can see, they're always Italo-centric. It's always about what the Italian has to gain from this relationship. There are several comedies. This is a musical about the arrival of a group of sex workers from Nigeria to Sicily, and it's based on the plot of West Side Story, and it features real sex workers recruited from the street who sing all their own songs. A very interesting experiment. And then there is a film that is based on A Day Without Mexicans, a comedy also, although bittersweet. And finally, there's a vampire movie with Dracula posing as an irregular migrant arriving on a raft from the Balkans. So that'll give you an idea of the range of films about migrants. Then, of course, there's some serious films that invoke history with the use of archival footage. And there are also films that refer to Italy's past, Italy's colonial past, with spectral, or what Elsasser calls postmodern effects. So there was a major shift in attention in 2013 with regard to the representation of migration. In October of 2013, over 600 people were drowned in 2 shipwrecks in a single month. The Italian media has been mainly preoccupied with arrivals at Italy's southern frontier, namely the islands off the south shore of Sicily since that time. Films depicting this route have also increased. And here is the main arrival point for most migratory ships or boats from the south. It's a small island called Lampedusa that you can't even see on a regular map because it is so tiny, 24 square kilometers. And several films have been based on this island, documentaries, feature films, docudramas, web series, video installations, and so on. The first major film that was made about the area was actually made before 2013, and it was Terraferma, one of the first Italian films about migration that was seen in North America, although it had very limited distribution. But it was, I think, on Netflix or one of those platforms for some time. It's the story of a fishing family in Lampedusa who rescue an Ethiopian migrant and her son in the face of, at great risk, because at the time, aiding immigrants was criminalized. So it's really the story of this humanitarian gesture that is very heroic and morally sound. And it focuses on a Sicilian woman who at first is reluctant to help the migrants, but eventually she concedes to allow them to stay. She helps the woman to deliver a child, and she becomes a rescuer. This film was criticized because it's really all about the Italians. It's about the ennobling effects that aiding migration can have on the Italian character. And many of the films that I discuss are really about that. They're about the Italians and what Italians have to gain morally and spiritually from the encounter with the other. So this is the film from which I took my cover image. It's very different. It also passes through Lampedusa, but it's about the African migrant as protagonist, and his subjectivity is in the foreground of the film. So this is a shot while they're still in Africa, because this film, unlike most Italian films, shows the migrant at the point of origin and traces his journey north. After the disaster of October, there was a huge search and rescue operation initiated by the Italian government called Mare Nostrum, and that figures in a few films that follow, including a film financed by the Italian Navy called CATIA's Choice. Critics have been severely, have not liked this film, serious critics, even though it was quite popular and has been seen by almost more people than any other film about immigration, because it was shown on television. But it arouses these patriotic feelings, privileging the official discourses of the Italian military, national pride, humanitarian acts of benevolence, and so on, providing an institutionally sanctioned story of humanitarian security that constructs us as heroic benefactors and them as passive victims. So in contrast to that film, we have a film called Fire at Sea, which is a poetic documentary by Gianfranco Rosi, who traveled to Lampedusa after the tragedy of October 2013 to make a film. He was driven by a sense of moral necessity. He said the Mediterranean Sea became a tomb, a cemetery with 25,000 dead bodies. It's a Holocaust, and we are part of this. This is a film that is beautiful visually, but has some aspects that are somewhat troubling, because again, it focuses on the Italians, although there are many scenes aboard a rescue ship of the Italian Navy. But the filmmaker problematizes his own distance from his subjects with devices like this screen between him and the first migrant person that we see. In fact, he had to wear a hazmat suit while he shot it, because it was during the Ebola pandemic, and he didn't have access to the migrants directly. He could only photograph them from a distance in protective gear. So the film has many really shocking images like this one, the rescuers and the rescued, very different figures, and it's clear who's doing the rescuing and who is in charge here. And this is the one figure in the film that transcends the divide between villagers and migrants. He's the only person in the film that has access to migrants, and he's the local doctor. However, when he interacts with them, and especially in this scene where he's examining the abdomen of a pregnant migrant woman we don't see her face. So in a way, she is reduced to mute body. And this is a problem that many people have found with the film in general, that the migrants are mute bodies. Here we have another hint of the distance between the islanders and the migrants, because again, this doctor who expresses great compassion and humanity is looking once again at this migrant figure on a screen, not directly. And in contrast to the wounded body of this migrant, you have a young man from the island, a 13-year-old Samuele, who's the protagonist, who is perfectly healthy, but has this sense of anxiety. And the anxiety, of course, is the anxiety that circulates in this frontier island that the locals feel but cannot fully explain, because they themselves do not actually see the migrants passing through. So this is used as a kind of synecdoche for what's going on. His anxiety, also he has trouble with his eyes, he can't see. And his not being able to see is also related to the locals not being able to see the full picture of what's happening around them. And I'll show just one clip from this one, and then I'll stop. Okay, I wanted to draw attention to the enormous expressive force of this very short scene. Rosie cannot speak to the migrant. He's behind a mask. He cannot even take it off when he photographs them. But yet he has managed to capture this extraordinary performance of affect, the woman's hesitation, her feeling violated in her modesty, her the prohibition against exposing her hair that the authorities force her to transgress, her embarrassment and her politeness and grace throughout all of this. All of these expressions, all of these affects are captured very quickly in this small scene. But this scene, like the rest of the film, has to be seen slowly. This is slow cinema in a way. It has to be absorbed carefully and slowly rather than rapidly and on the small screen. So part of my book too is about the conditions of viewing and the way that the meanings change when viewing conditions are different. So I realize that my time is up, so I will try to quickly conclude that, as you can see, I have critical things to say about most films that I've talked about at least, and notwithstanding their collective shortcomings, the existing corpus of Italian films on recent migrations to Italy provides a rich archive of material, however flawed and problematic, for the exploration of contemporary Italian attitudes towards immigration, borders, national belonging, as well as a reflection on the ongoing construction of racial hierarchies and structures of differential inclusion in neo-colonial Europe at present. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I took a lot of notes. As the media librarian, I think I have my job cut out for me to update our collection in Italian films. Thank you so much. I would like to take this opportunity now to do a little one-on-one talking with you before we open it up to questions from the audience. And my first question is not on your work, but on you personally. So you were born in Ireland, you came to the States. How did your love and scholarship in Italian film start?
Well, I studied in Italy before I came to the United States, but I wasn't yet interested in cinema. I studied literature for my PhD, and then I became a cinephile while in graduate school. And then when I moved to Los Angeles, I signed up for several courses in the graduate program in the School of Cinematic Arts. because I wanted to learn to analyze film and write about film, and that became the focus of my work.
Excellent. Do you also do scholarship on Irish film though, or have you?
Yes, I have
okay.
done some work on Irish film. I've published some things on Irish film as well. Yes.
Correct. Oh, very interesting. You've had an interesting life. So one of the questions that we'd like to ask you is, so for people who are new to your scholarship, how would you define migrant anxieties? And I think you may have covered this, but I thought we would just circle back and just give a nice definition of it.
It refers to the anxiety that is generated among Italians about the arrival of mass migration, which was a new phenomenon for them. And it's also, of course, the anxieties of the migrants themselves, who have to adapt sometimes to horrific circumstances and implacable legislation to be able to settle in the new country. And it's also a sense of diffuse anxiety within these film texts themselves. There are competing affects, there are competing points of view, even within the same film. For example, there's a film called Once You're Born, You Can No Longer Hide. And it starts out by bringing us, the audience, to sympathize with these migrant figures. But by the end of the film, you discover almost at the last minute that the young man you'd been rooting for was actually a pimp and a liar and a thief. So these films, you know, they sort of slide into the fear aspect. They start out with the empathy, and then these other tensions take over the representation. It's quite fascinating. So that's part of what I mean by anxieties, these representational tensions that are at work, even in some very fine films.
Right, excellent. So in your book, you discuss the intersections of migration anxieties and race, gender, and rural or urban spaces. Thinking about your future work, either your own or other scholars, where do you think there needs to be more exploration and scholarship around these intersections?
Yes, one of the things I'm working on now is, I don't know if it'll be a book, it'll probably just be a couple of articles, is the issue of transgender migrants and the way the word trans functions both to describe how they travel and how they become something else in the process, and how when they cross the border also crosses them. So the way identities mutate and are rendered fluid through border crossing. So that's one of the areas that my work is engaged with. Another area that I'm very interested in is pursuing films more broadly in European cinema around issues of affect, around border crossing and affect, maybe a comparative study with films coming out from other countries, because there are clear parallels with some of them.
Interesting. We'll look forward to having you back at Faculty Pub Night. Can you talk more about the process of writing and researching for this book? You mentioned that it took you 10 years, and I'd be interested to hear how that went.
When I became engaged and fascinated by these films, it was, I realized I had to write about them. So I began at first writing articles, and then I realized I had so much work, it really needed to be a book. But the problem was that every year some new films started coming out, and the direction and focus of these migrant films, if you call them that, these things were changing, and I always had to catch up with what was new. But at a certain point, you know, I had a publishing contract, and I said to myself, they probably won't take my book if I wait another 10 years. So it was time to wrap up. So it was really that brought it to an end. Otherwise, I'd probably still be writing new aspects.
Well, it's exciting that there is so much information out there. Yeah, that's really cool. So films in Hollywood are often a beat later than in leading cultural change, but still a film can help quickly redefine a conversation in a way that more immediate and topical than other modes of art. So like we have Minari, which is out now, that focuses on South Koreans coming to America, a better life. Do you think that Italian cinema's portrayal of migrants has the same potential?
Well, this is a big question. I'm very interested in the films you mentioned. By the way, I haven't seen them yet, and I'm really looking forward to watching Minari as soon as I get a moment.
Me too.
But to return to the question, Italian cinema itself is not doing well. And part of it is the competition from Hollywood. But since the Italians started building multiplexes, there is a kind of a custom that in each of the multiplexes, one theater is reserved for Italian cinema. And that has kind of helped Italian cinema to survive. However, if you go to a film, an Italian film, unless it's a comedy, there are likely to be 2 or 3 people in that particular screening room. So dramas are not popular in Italy. Comedies are popular. Italians love their own comedies, and they love Hollywood for everything else. Their comedies are not exported. Their comedies have no market overseas at present, but they earn millions of dollars, millions of euros in Italy, especially, there's some very well-known contemporary comedians that bring in huge money, but cinema in the way it was enjoyed and talked about several years ago, it's not the same thing in Italy anymore. So I think American cinema has actually more potential for revealing hot topics than Italian cinema. Eventually, everything is shown on television, of course, and that is the moment in which these revelations can occur. But often the serious films are scheduled for 3 in the morning or 11 p.m. or, at times that are not convenient. So unless you're really driven, as I am when I go over, I wait till all hours of the night to watch something I've been trying to find in North America. But there's very little market for them in Italy, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know from trying to purchase 4-year classes and stuff, it is difficult.
Yes.
But that would be interesting if American cinema can somewhat lead the way and maybe, shine some humanity and bright light in changing minds in Italy. That would be very interesting. And I would assume that the new streaming channels are also big in Italy too.
Yes, they are. And there have been a couple of 2, I think there have been 2 series about migrants. But I have no access to Italian television here. I can't. I've tried, but I can't access it. If I was in Europe, I could, but not here. So I think it's through television that these revelations will be made over time, not film.
I know that when I'm watching Netflix or Amazon Prime, I am definitely looking at foreign series. I love it. I'm fascinated by it.
Yes,
by looking how people live in those countries and how they think. And
that's true. But the Italian series that we get here are mostly mafia.
Yes, you're right.
That's the problem. That's what interests American audiences that's coming out of Italy. It's unfortunate, but it's real.
Yeah, you're right. And there's like detective and mafia.
And Columbo, of course. Yes. That's it.
Okay, so I noticed that we do have some questions coming in, so I will just ask you maybe one more for now. So how are migrant generations different? So maybe looking at the first generation of immigrants and then the recent.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Okay, so what are the difference between the different generations of migrants?
Yes, we now have 2nd and 3rd generations in Italy. I say we as though I lived there, but now you have a generation of young people who were born in Italy and who have started making their own films. And my next project, by the way, I forgot to mention, is also about this. The new generation of, they call them seconde generazioni, the kinds of films that they make. Unfortunately, so far, they're not terribly interesting, but they are important. And I just want to give them visibility and circulation by engaging with them. But the second generation has had a very hard time because there isn't automatic Italian citizenship for kids born in Italy. They have to wait till they're 18, and then they have to catch this window of opportunity. And if they miss it, then they're not Italians, and they have to renew their residency every year. So it's very difficult.
That's harsh. Okay, so Alicia Partnoy has a question.
Yes,
a few years ago, you invited to LMU a filmmaker who worked in his documentaries with actual video taken by immigrants with their phones. Was that Rosie's? And are there other films that you have studied where the migrants have a strong agency?
Yes, this is a very, very important question. I'm glad Alicia asked it. There are a few. The filmmaker I invited was Andrea Segre. He has made several films, some of them with an Ethiopian immigrant who arrived on a ship that was almost shipwrecked, and they have done very interesting work. They've gone to Africa, they've interviewed people in detention camps and so on, and including that film with the footage taken by a passenger on a ship that was then pushed back. Unfortunately, those films are not circulated. They do not make it to the theaters. They're only shown in classes and at festivals. And this is the great tragedy of, Italian cinema. It's hard enough to get people out of their homes for a comedy, let alone serious documentaries like this. However, Dagmawi, the migrant who works with, the Ethiopian who works with Andrea Segre, has made a few films now on his own, including a beautiful poetic film that is a reflection of the tragedy of October 2013, but it doesn't show people. It shows instead their names, and their names are written in their own script, and their names are translated and chanted, as well as other poetic images on the visual track. It's very short, 11 minutes long, very evocative. But again, there's no mass appeal. It's people like me and others who are sympathetic to the topic that watch these. So it's the problem of distribution and market is unfortunately at the heart of this.
Thank you. So here's a familiar name. Ed Gaffney says, I love the way that Lamerica offers Italians to see two characters, one a young Albanian, another an older Italian who was stuck in Albania after World War II, and now both of them are literally on the same boat. Are you asking us to recognize that Italian cinema and a whole range of films from comedy to vampire films that also present the question of whether the Italians or we can get it or understand that all of us are on the same boat? Understand they and the Albanian, okay, that's it, I think.
Okay. The answer is no. All of these films, or practically all of them, reinstate the hierarchy of us and them, unfortunately. And the films that are sympathetic to migrants put the idea of the us being the benevolent rescuer, helper, but this happens by diminishing the agency of the other. Even Lamerica does this. It shows that the two are in the same boat, but what they do in the end is it reduces the self and the other to the self-same. It's not really a film about Albanians, it's a film about Italians, and it turns the Albanian into an Italian in order to make its point. So clearly the intentions were good, but already compromised from the start. Sorry?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's it. That's really it.
Does it show that the Italians are kind of like saviors?
Oh
in a
yes,
sense?
there's a strong strain of that.
Yeah.
There's one film made recently called The Order of Things, which is about a policeman who's sent to Libya to tighten the controls, because Libya now Italians push back the migrants to Libya, where they linger in atrocious conditions for years in detention camps. And this is a dramatic feature film about an Italian policeman who goes to Libya and discovers what's happening. And he has this moment in which he decides to rescue this woman who asks for help. But at the end of the film, he decides not to. He loses his courage. And it's a brave film because it is so realistic. Because having seen all these other films about rescuers and saviors and, Italians with a heart of gold, this film shows the cruel reality of migratory policy, but also the hypocrisy of the fantasy that Italians will save the other at any cost, at a big cost to themselves.
Huh, interesting. Thank you. Ellen Ensher says, thank you. The perspective taking is fascinating. What films do you recommend that you feel take a balanced perspective of immigrants and host country nationals?
What films would I recommend?
For a balanced perspective of immigrants and host country nationals.
Are we talking about Italy, do you think? Do you think Ellen means Italy?
I assume so, but
yes. Okay,
we could go both.
Italian films, the one I would recommend is the one I've just described, The Order of Things, which is a fascinating film, but of course is not available with subtitles. I think all of the films that I talk about are interesting, but they have to be watched with a critical eye. I think Fire at Sea is definitely worth looking at, but it should be watched twice, to fully understand the mechanics of identification and disidentification that are going on. As for films about migrants, I see here that she's saying, can any films, not necessarily.
Right, from any country then.
Well, there are lots of European films that I admire. There's there's the Belgian filmmaking duo, the Dardenne brothers, for example, have made a few films about migrants. One is called La Promesse. Another more recent one is called Veronica's Secret, I think. Very powerful film about an Albanian migrant living in Belgium and the compromises she has to make to stay. But I forget, I'm not sure if I have the name right. And then there's Iñárritu's film Beautiful that is shot in Barcelona. It's a fascinating film to me. It's not mainly about migrants, but the migrant figures are very prominent in it, and the whole interpersonal relationship and the contrast and the issues that come up are fascinating. So there are several French films as well that are really worthwhile.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, Dean Brancalini, who loves Italian films, said, how much do you think this is us versus them mentality is wait, let me do that again. How much do you think this us versus them mentality is reinforced by the situation you mentioned? Even someone born in Italy isn't automatically a citizen of Italy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's all there. There has been a huge activist surge to change the laws. And among those who are fighting this are young activists, second generation activists. I like to call them the new Italians because they're, rather than calling them, children of migrants, they're the new Italians. And they're fighting, shoulder to shoulder with young Italians who have the same principles. So there is a groundswell among the youth to change things. But Italian politics has really gone very far to the right in the last few years. So it's not very hopeful at the moment as to whether change can happen soon. There is some change on the on the horizon for citizenship, though. There's a new concept introduced called cultural citizenship that they're working on, which is a compromise between the law of blood, which is what prevails at the moment, and the law of the earth, the jus solis versus the jus sanguinis. There's now a third option. So that's being proposed as a compromise in the meantime, and that's made some people quite happy.
Okay, we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to take a question from Professor Anna Harrison. She actually has 3 questions, but we'll take them one at a time, I think. First, can films that, as you put it, ennoble the Italian protagonist offer a moral model that might precipitate change on the part of Italian viewers, change positive for immigrants to Italy?
So, yes, I see the point that any expression or any shift towards empathy and opening to encounter and interpersonal exchange is a positive thing. The problem is that it remains on the level of benevolence, and there is somehow built into that, the benevolence, there's a sense of superiority. And there are some films that actually show that, that the Italians will accept the foreigner, will welcome the foreigner up to a point, provided that their cooking doesn't smell too much. For example, there's been just rows in apartment buildings because of the savory spices used by some communities. And these are spices the Italians don't particularly like the scent of. And so up to a point, we will be benevolent, but culturally, we are, we prefer our own culture. I hate to generalize in this way, but I am drawing on examples that I know of, and my data may be pretty limited, but so I'm adding this proviso.
She also says, do the films explore differences between Southern and Northern Italian responses? And if so, what can you say about this?
Yes, there are. The films suggest that the Southerners are more welcoming. Whether this is a fact or not is something entirely different, because these are cinematic constructions. But there is a sense that the Southerners, because they have been called Moroccans, and there was a huge surge of migration from south to north in the 60s, where Italians who moved north for jobs were racialized. They were called Moroccans. And so they were once called Moroccans. And the idea is that they know what it's like to be to have people look down on them. And that appears in some of the films. There are several films set in the north that do show significant prejudice. But I don't want to get into naming them. Yeah.
Okay. I think we're going to go for the last question is going to be from Dean Brancolini. Could these films about migration be highlighted and promoted through the film festivals in Italy, which we all know are so prominent?
Some of them are promoted through film festivals. In fact, one of the best made films on the subject, Once You're Born, came to Los Angeles as part of a film festival, and I was surprised that it hadn't been nominated as Italy's entry to the Oscar. But the producer told me that for Italians, films about immigration are unpopular, and they couldn't nominate a film with such an unpopular subject, which I found astonishing. So these films are not particularly favored on the festival circuit.
That's really too bad, because that's really too bad.
Well, they display a negative view of Italians that not all Italians want to look at. So
yeah, very interesting. Thank you. This has been amazing. I've took so many notes throughout this. Can't wait to do my Google searching. Thank you very much for sitting with us, and I'm glad that we could have this time to share with you. I know you're going to be traveling soon, so safe travel, please. And I want to thank Áine for bringing this interesting book to our attention. We do have it in the library, by the way. We have it in ebook format. So please check it out. Check it out. As we wrap up another fascinating and inspiring year of Faculty Pub Night, we of course want to thank all of our presenters that have been come to us during this very difficult year. It's been the light of the year, as a matter of fact. And many thanks to our Dean, Christine Brancolini, for her continual support of the Hannon Library's fabulous programming. And last but not least, please take time to fill out the very short survey that will pop up once you leave the program, as it will help us plan and improve our future programming. So good night. Thank you again for your attendance throughout the academic year, and we will see you again in the fall. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Áine O'Healy.
Thank you, Rhonda. Good night.
Good night.